The universe learned too late why humanity kept saying, "Do not push us further." Part 1. 50 years had passed since humanity first stepped onto the galactic stage. And in that time, they had earned a quiet reputation among the stars' traders, healers, diplomats, and dreamers who built bridges instead of burning them down. The Galactic Concord, an alliance of over 200 species, had welcomed humans with cautious curiosity at first, then with something close to affection as the decades rolled by. These strange bipeds from the blue-green world called Earth seemed content to share their music, their medicines, and their odd talent for finding common ground between species who had been enemies for centuries. Ambassador Park J1 stood at the center of the Great Concord Chamber, surrounded by thousands of delegates from across the known universe, and he felt the weight of their stares pressing down on him like gravity itself. Today was not a day for music or medicine. Today was a day for demands. 3 merchant vessels, he said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the vast hall. Carrying 2,000 of our people, fathers, mothers, children, engineers, teachers, destroyed without warning by the Volthari Dominion. A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembly, but J1 noticed that few seemed surprised. The Volthari had been expanding aggressively for years, swallowing smaller species and territories with the hunger of a beast that knew no satisfaction. And the Concord had done nothing but issue statements of concern. High Commander Zorath Kell of the Volthari stood in his delegation section. His scaled face twisted into what passed for amusement among his kind, a cruel stretching of lips over razor-sharp teeth that made younger delegates look away in fear. "The human speaks of losses," Zorath Kell called out, not bothering to request formal speaking rights. "But what losses matter from a species so weak they cannot even protect their own ships?" Laughter echoed from the Volthari section, and J1 noticed with bitter disappointment that several other delegations joined in. Species who had smiled at humanity for decades now showed their true feelings. "We have asked the Concord for justice," J1 continued, refusing to let anger color his words. "And we have been told to accept our losses, to move forward. To understand that conflict with the Dominion would be costly for everyone. But I must ask this assembly a simple question. What is the value of an alliance that cannot protect its members?" The chamber fell silent. It was a question many had asked privately, but none had dared speak aloud. Zorath Kell stepped forward, his massive form casting shadows across the delegates nearest to him, and his voice boomed with contempt as he addressed not just J1, but the entire assembly. "Humans are soft prey," he declared, "useful for trade and entertainment, but worthless in matters of power. You have no warships, no military fleet, no weapons worth fearing. And yet you stand here making demands as if you were our equals?" He laughed again, and the sound echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across an empty plain. "The Volthari Dominion does not pay reparations to the weak. We take what we want, and we answer to no one." J1 watched the High Commander's display with steady eyes, and when the laughter died down, he spoke again in a voice so quiet that the entire chamber leaned forward to hear him. 50 years ago, when humanity joined this Concord, we made a choice. We chose peace over power, cooperation over conquest, and hope over fear, because we had seen what war could do to a species, having nearly destroyed ourselves before we ever reached the stars. He paused, letting his words sink into the minds of every delegate present. "We built no warships because we believed this alliance would protect us. We trained no armies because we trusted that justice would prevail among civilized beings. We showed you our kindness, our creativity, our willingness to help any species in need. And you saw these things as weakness." His eyes locked with Zorath Kell's across the vast distance of the chamber. "We are asking you, one final time," J1 said, each word falling like a stone into still water. Do not push us further. The silence that followed was absolute, and then the Valkyrie delegation erupted into mocking laughter that spread through the chamber like a disease, infecting species after species, until it seemed the entire galaxy was laughing at the small human standing alone in the center of the great hall. Zorath Kell wiped a tear of amusement from his scaled cheek and shook his head with theatrical pity. What will you do, little human? Trade us to death, heal us into submission, compose a song so sad we weep ourselves to destruction. More laughter, and J1 simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had long suspected before turning and walking out of the chamber without another word. Back on Earth, in a secure bunker deep beneath the mountains of Switzerland, the United Defense Council watched the broadcast in grim silence. Minister Yoon Soo-min turned to her colleagues with eyes that held neither fear nor hesitation. They have made their choice, she said quietly. General Han Tae-jun, the eldest member of the council, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a long moment before speaking. We hoped it would never come to this. We prayed that the universe would prove us wrong about the nature of power. But hope and prayer cannot bring back 2,000 souls. A secure communication channel opened, and the words that appeared on their screens were simple, direct, and final. Authorization requested for Protocol Prometheus, all assets standing by for activation. Soo-min looked around the table at faces she had known for decades, scientists, soldiers, diplomats, and dreamers who'd all carried the same secret burden. All prayed for the same peaceful future that now seemed impossible. We gave them every chance, she said, her voice steady as stone, and they laughed at our dead. She entered her authorization code, and one by one, the other council members did the same. Deep in the asteroid belts beyond Mars, in shipyards that had been silent for 30 years, lights began to flicker on for the first time since their construction, and humanity's greatest secret slowly awakened from its long slumber. The universe learned too late why humanity kept saying, "Do not push us further." Part 2. The emergency session of the United Defense Council had been going for 16 hours straight, and the tension in the underground chamber was thick enough to cut with a blade. Screens covered every wall, showing data, projections, and the faces of military commanders from every corner of human space. Minister Yoon Soo-min stood before the main display, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that tugged at her bones. Before we proceed, she said to the assembled leaders, I want everyone to understand exactly what we are authorizing. This is not a decision we can take back, and the galaxy will never see us the same way again. Admiral Choi Min-ho sat in the front row, his weathered face a mask of controlled emotion that hid a grief so deep it had become part of his very soul. His daughter, Choi Yuna, had been aboard one of the first merchant ships destroyed by the Valkyrie. She had been 23 years old, a medical officer on her first deep space assignment, and she had died never knowing that her father commanded weapons capable of turning stars into graves. Show them, Soo-min said to the technicians, and the main screen shifted to display something that made even the veteran commanders catch their breath. The Prometheus fleet appeared in all its terrible glory, 40 warships that had been built in absolute secrecy over 3 decades, hidden in hollowed-out asteroids and dark stations where no alien sensors could reach. Each vessel was a masterpiece of destruction, designed not for conquest but for ending wars so quickly and decisively that enemies would surrender rather than face annihilation. We told ourselves we would never need these, Soo-min continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. We convinced ourselves that peace would prevail, that our kindness would be answered with kindness, but we also knew, deep in our hearts, that the universe is not always kind to the gentle. General Han Tae-jun rose from his seat, his old bones creaking with the effort, and walked to stand beside the minister. I was there when we made this decision, he said, his voice rough with age and memory. 40 years ago, when we were new to the galactic stage and saw how other species treated the weak, we swore that humanity would never be helpless again, even if we had to hide our strength behind a mask of peace. The debate began, voices rising and falling as different factions argued their positions. Some wanted a measured response, a surgical strike against Velthari military targets that would send a message without escalating to full war. Others argued for negotiations, believing that strength shown was different from strength used. But then the screens flickered, and new images appeared that silenced every voice in the chamber. A human agricultural colony called New Hope had been attacked just hours ago. The Velthari had descended without warning, burning fields and buildings, killing 15,000 colonists who had no weapons to defend themselves. Among the dead were 3,000 children who had been attending school when the bombs fell. Admiral Choi stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the images of destruction. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "My daughter died 3 weeks ago," he said, "and I told myself to be patient, to trust in the process, to believe that justice would come through proper channels. But now I look at these images and I see 3,000 children who will never grow up, never fall in love, never hold their own children in their arms." He turned to face the council, and his eyes burned with a cold fire that seemed to freeze the air around him. "How many more must we lose before we accept that the universe respects only strength, that our enemies will keep pushing until we push back so hard they can never recover?" The vote was unanimous. Not a single voice spoke against activation. Across human space, in hidden shipyards and secret bases, the Prometheus fleet began to wake. Engines that had never fired roared to life. Weapon systems that had only been tested in simulations powered up for the first time. And crews who had trained for decades in secrecy finally prepared to show the galaxy what humanity had been hiding. Admiral Choi took command of the flagship, a massive vessel named Remember Earth that served as both carrier and command center for the entire fleet. He walked through corridors filled with young officers who looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination, and he saw his daughter's face in every one of them. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we have received confirmation from all 40 vessels. The fleet is ready to deploy on your order." Choi nodded once, then opened a channel to the Velthari Dominion. His message was brief, direct, and delivered without any emotion that might be mistaken for weakness. "This is Admiral Choi Minho of the United Earth Defense Force, speaking to the Velthari Dominion. You were warned not to push us further, and you chose to ignore that warning. You have killed our people, laughed at our grief, and continued your attacks even as we asked for peace. But we are done asking." He paused, letting the silence carry its own weight across the void of space. "You have 24 hours to withdraw from all territories you have taken from us. Return all human prisoners alive and unharmed, and surrender High Commander Zorth Kell for trial. If you refuse, or if you harm one more human being, we will show you why humanity spent 50 years hiding its true strength." The message ended, and across the galaxy, species who had intercepted the transmission looked at each other in confusion. What could the peaceful humans possibly do against the military might of the Velthari Dominion? They would learn the answer soon enough, and none of them would ever forget it. Admiral Choi stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching stars drift past the viewports, and he whispered words that only he could hear. "I am coming, Yuna. I am coming to make them answer for what they took from us." The fleet moved toward the border, and the universe held its breath. The universe learned too late why humanity kept saying, "Do not push us further." Part 3. The Velthari border system of Kethris Prime had been transformed into a fortress of war, with 500 warships arranged in perfect formation around the system's central planet. High Commander Zorth Kell stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by his most trusted officers, and he laughed at the reports coming in from his scouts. 40 ships, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. The humans send 40 ships against 500, and they expect us to be afraid? His officers laughed with him, their scaled faces twisted in amusement at the foolishness of these soft creatures from the blue-green world. They had crushed species twice as numerous and 10 times as fierce. What could humans possibly do against the might of the Dominion? The Prometheus fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and Admiral Choi studied the enemy formation with eyes that had seen 1,000 simulations of this exact moment. The Valkyrie had arranged themselves in a classic defensive sphere, maximizing their firepower while protecting their command ships at the center. Admiral, his tactical officer reported, enemy fleet is powering weapons and advancing to intercept. They outnumber us more than 12 to 1. Choi nodded calmly, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the enemy approach. Open a channel to the Valkyrie commander, he ordered, and when the connection was established, he spoke clearly and without hesitation. High Commander Zorth Kell, this is Admiral Choi Minho. I am giving you one final opportunity to surrender your forces and face justice for your crimes against humanity. Refuse, and I cannot promise you will survive what comes next. Zorth Kell's image appeared on the screen, his laughter echoing through the bridge of the human flagship. You dare threaten me with 40 ancient vessels, while I command 500 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy. You are either brave beyond reason or foolish beyond help. Little human. I am neither, Choi replied softly. I am simply tired of watching my people die while you call us weak. Weapons officer, target the first line of enemy vessels and fire at will. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. The human ships unleashed weapons that the Valkyrie had never seen, never imagined, never prepared for. Adaptive kinetic warheads that changed trajectory mid-flight to avoid point defense systems, slammed into enemy vessels with devastating precision, while electromagnetic cascade bombs disabled entire squadrons at once, leaving ships drifting helplessly in the void. The first wave of Valkyrie ships, over 100 vessels, was destroyed or disabled in less than 20 minutes. Zorth Kell watched in disbelief as his carefully arranged formation crumbled into chaos. Ships that had been advancing confidently moments ago now tumbled through space as burning wrecks, their crews screaming on open channels as fire and vacuum claimed their lives. Impossible, he breathed, his confident sneer replaced by something that looked dangerously close to fear. How can they have such weapons? They were supposed to be peaceful, harmless, weak. His officers looked to him for orders, but for the first time in his long career, the High Commander had no answers. The human fleet advanced with terrifying precision, each vessel moving in perfect coordination with the others as if guided by a single mind. They targeted command ships and weapons platforms first, leaving transport vessels and medical ships untouched whenever possible. Admiral Choi watched the destruction with no joy in his heart, only a grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Open another channel, he ordered, and when the connection was established, his voice carried across the battlefield. Valkyrie forces, your first line has been destroyed. Stand down now, and no more of you need to die. We do not seek the destruction of your species, only the end of your aggression against ours. For a moment, hope flickered in the void. Several Valkyrie captains began signaling their willingness to surrender, their ships powering down weapons and coming to a halt. But Zorth Kell would not accept defeat so easily. All remaining vessels, ignore the human lies and attack their homeworld directly. He screamed into his command channel, destroy their precious Earth and let them know the cost of defying the Dominion. 200 ships broke formation and accelerated toward the system's edge, their course set for Sol and the vulnerable blue-green world that humans called home. Choi watched them go, his face expressionless, and then he spoke a single word. Interceptors. 20 human vessels peeled away from the main fleet, their engines flaring with power that seemed impossible for ships their size. They caught the fleeing Valkyrie in less than an hour, surrounding them in a sphere of destruction that left no escape. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 6 more hours, and when it was over, 300 Valkyrie warships had been destroyed, 150 had surrendered, and the remaining 50 drifted as lifeless hulks through the cold darkness of space. Zoreth Kel's flagship was disabled but intact, its engines dead and its weapons silent. The High Commander himself was found cowering in an escape pod, his earlier bravado replaced by pathetic pleas for mercy. Admiral Choi had him brought to the bridge of Remember Earth and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You called us soft prey," he said quietly. "You laughed at our dead, mocked our grief, and continued killing even when we begged you to stop. Now you will face trial for your crimes, and the galaxy will see that humanity's mercy has limits." Across the galactic concord, species who had watched the battle in stunned silence began to realize what they had witnessed. The harmless humans had hidden an arsenal capable of destroying fleets, and they had shown restraint even in victory. One delegate whispered what many were thinking. What have they awakened? The answer was simple. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and the universe would never see humanity the same way again. The universe learned too late why humanity kept saying, "Do not push us further." Part 4. The Prometheus fleet arrived at the Valkyrie homeworld 3 days after the Battle of Cathrus Prime, and the 40 human warships took position in orbit around a planet that had never known the fear of invasion until now. Ambassador Park Jae-won stood beside Admiral Choi on the bridge of Remember Earth, looking down at the cities and fields of a world that had sent death and destruction to so many others. Millions of Valkyrie looked up at the sky and saw the ships that had crushed their mighty fleet, and they waited for the fire to fall. But the fire did not come. "Open a broadcast channel to the entire planet," Jae-won ordered, and when the connection was established, his voice reached every home, every street, every frightened child hiding in their parents' arms. "People of the Valkyrie homeworld, I am Ambassador Park Jae-won of the United Earth Government, and I come to you not with weapons but with words. We could destroy your cities, burn your fields, and leave your world as barren as you left our colonies. But we will not." He paused, letting hope flicker in hearts that had expected only death. "We are not here for revenge. We are here for justice. Your military leaders ordered attacks on peaceful human settlements, killed our children, laughed at our grief, and refused every offer of peace we extended. Those leaders will face trial for their crimes, but the people of this world, who had no say in those decisions, will not be punished for the sins of their masters." Across the planet, Valkyrie citizens looked at each other in disbelief. No species in galactic history had ever shown such mercy to a defeated enemy. The Dominion's own doctrine demanded the complete destruction of any world that dared to resist their rule. The broadcast continued as Jae-won laid out humanity's terms. The military caste that had ruled the Dominion for centuries would be dissolved. Democratic elections would be held under neutral observation, and the Valkyrie would pay reparations to the families of those they had killed. But their world would remain intact. Their people would remain free, and their future would be their own to build. Within hours, uprisings began across the planet. Valkyrie citizens who had lived under the iron rule of the military caste for generations rose against their oppressors, not because the humans told them to, but because they finally had hope that freedom was possible. The military leaders who had cheered Zoreth Kel's attacks now found themselves hunted by their own people, dragged from their hiding places and delivered to human custody for the trials that would follow. Meanwhile, at the Galactic Concord headquarters, chaos reigned. Delegates screamed at each other across the great chamber, their carefully maintained diplomatic composure shattered by what they had witnessed. Some demanded that humanity be expelled from the Concord, fearing what else they might be hiding. Others argued that the humans had shown remarkable restraint and should be praised for their mercy. Ambassador J1 returned to the chamber 1 week after the battle, walking the same path he had walked when he begged for justice and received only laughter. This time, no one laughed. 50 years ago, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. Humanity joined this concord with hope in our hearts. We believed that civilized species could resolve their differences through dialogue, that justice could be found in deliberation, that peace was possible without the threat of violence. He looked around at the faces of delegates who had once dismissed him as a representative of a weak and harmless species. We were wrong, not about the value of peace, but about the willingness of others to respect it. We offered friendship and were answered with contempt. We offered trade and were answered with theft. We offered our hand and were answered with attacks that killed 17,000 of our people, including children whose only crime was being born human. His voice hardened, though it remained quiet and controlled. We did not want this war. We begged you, this assembly, to help us prevent it, to stand with us against aggression, to show the Dominion that the Concord would protect its members. You did nothing but advise us to accept our losses and avoid conflict. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Remember that, J1 said, his eyes sweeping across the assembly. The next time you call us soft, the next time you laugh at our grief, the next time you mistake our kindness for weakness, we chose peace because we value life, not because we fear death. We chose mercy because we know the cost of vengeance, not because we lack the strength for it. He turned and walked toward the exit, then paused and spoke over his shoulder. Humanity will remain in this concord, not because we need your protection, but because we still believe that peace is possible. But understand this clearly. We will never again trust our safety to the goodwill of others. We have learned that lesson, and we have learned it in blood. The Concord voted that same day to grant humanity a permanent seat on the Security Council, the governing body that made decisions on matters of war and peace. It was not a gesture of respect, but of fear. In the weeks that followed, species from across the galaxy began seeking alliances with Earth, some out of genuine admiration for humanity's restraint and mercy. Others simply because they wanted to be on the right side of the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Choi did not participate in the political maneuvering. Instead, he traveled to the memorial that had been built on the site of the New Hope colony, where 3,000 children had died in the Valkyrie attack. He stood alone among the graves, the wind carrying the whispers of the dead, and he spoke to the daughter he had lost. "It is over, Yuna," he said softly. "They will answer for what they did to you, to all of you. I am sorry it took so long." He placed a flower on the memorial stone and walked away, his duty complete but his grief eternal. The universe learned too late why humanity kept saying, "Do not push us further." Part 5. 5 years had passed since the war that changed the galaxy, and the universe had settled into a new order that none could have predicted. Humanity, once dismissed as harmless traders and dreamers, now stood as the reluctant guardians of galactic peace. The Valkyrie Dominion was gone, replaced by the Valkyrie Republic, a democratic government built on the ashes of military rule. Former High Commander Zorath Kell sat in a prison cell awaiting the final verdict of his war crimes trial, stripped of his rank, his pride, and his power. The species that had once conquered worlds now focused on rebuilding their own, guided by leaders chosen by the people rather than imposed by force. Admiral Choi Minho had retired from active duty, though he remained an advisor to the United Earth Defense Force. His hair had turned completely white in the years since the war, and his steps had grown slower. But his mind remained sharp and his counsel remained valued by those who would carry humanity's legacy forward. On this particular day, he stood in a training facility on Earth's moon, watching young officers run through simulations of battles they might one day face. Among them was Commander Kang Jiyan, a woman of 32 years who had risen through the ranks faster than anyone in the history of the fleet. "You wanted to see me, Admiral?" Jiyan asked, approaching with the crisp salute of a soldier who respected tradition. Choi gestured for her to walk with him, and together they moved toward the observation deck that looked out over the lunar surface and the blue-green world beyond. "You have been assigned command of the relief fleet," he said, "the one being sent to respond to the distress calls from the outer rim." Ji Yeon nodded. She had heard the reports. Something called the Hollow Swarm had emerged from the unexplored regions of the galaxy, a mindless consuming force that devoured everything in its path without reason or mercy. 3 species had already sent desperate pleas for help. Species that had once laughed at humanity, but now begged for salvation. "I wanted to give you advice before you leave," Choi continued, his eyes fixed on the distant stars. "Wisdom from an old man who has seen too much war and too little peace." "I would be honored to hear it, Admiral." Choi was silent for a moment, gathering thoughts that had taken decades to form. "When I led the fleet against the Vulturi," he said quietly, "I was driven by grief and anger. My daughter had been killed, and I wanted vengeance more than justice. It was only when I saw the fear in Zorth Kel's eyes that I understood the truth. Becoming monsters to defeat monsters makes us no better than those we fight." He turned to face Ji Yeon, and his eyes held both sorrow and hope. "Show them mercy first, always. Offer peace before you offer war. Extend your hand before you clench your fist. Give them every chance to choose a better path." Ji Yeon listened intently, understanding that these words came from experience paid for in blood. "But if they refuse," she said softly, completing the thought she sensed he wanted her to reach on her own. Choi nodded slowly, a grim smile crossing his weathered face. "If they refuse, then you remind them why humanity spent 50 years hiding its true strength, not because we enjoy destruction, but because some threats cannot be reasoned with, some evils cannot be negotiated away. And sometimes the only language the universe understands is force." Ji Yeon saluted again, this time with deeper meaning, and prepared to leave. "One more thing," Choi called after her. "The species you are going to save. They did not help us when we needed them. They laughed at our warnings and looked away from our suffering. You might be tempted to let that influence how you treat them. And what would you advise, Admiral?" "Save them anyway," Choi said simply. "Prove that humanity is better than those who wronged us. Let our mercy be our legacy, not our vengeance." Ji Yeon departed for her mission, and Choi watched her go with the pride of a teacher whose student had learned well. Across the galaxy, the relief fleet assembled, 50 vessels carrying weapons, supplies, medical equipment, and the hope of salvation for species facing extinction. They were joined by ships from a dozen other species, forming a coalition that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. Ambassador Park Jae-won, now elderly and retired from active service, sat in his garden on Earth, watching the fleet depart on the news broadcast. Beside him sat a young alien child, a refugee from one of the species threatened by the swarm, who had been placed in his care while their parents served in the coalition forces. "Why do humans fight so hard for others?" the child asked, their large eyes reflecting the lights of the departing ships. Jae-won smiled and placed a gentle hand on the child's head. "Because someone pushed us once," he said softly, "and we remember what that felt like. The fear, the helplessness, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would come to help. We will not let others feel that way if we can prevent it." "But they did not help you when you needed them." "No," Jae-won agreed. "They did not. And for a time, we were angry, bitter, filled with the desire to let them suffer as we had suffered. But then we realized that becoming like those who hurt us would mean they had truly won, that they had changed us into something we never wanted to be. He looked up at the stars, at the fleet that carried humanity's answer to the galaxy's call for help. We chose to be protectors instead of conquerors, healers instead of destroyers, because that is who we want to be. Not because others deserve our help, but because helping is what makes us human. The child was silent for a long moment, then asked one final question. Will you always be there to help us? J1 looked at the young alien with kindness in his ancient eyes. We cannot promise to always succeed, he said. But we can promise to always try. And we can promise that anyone who threatens the innocent will learn the same lesson the Valtteri learned. Do not push humanity further, because our patience has limits, but our determination has none. Far across the stars, Commander Kang Ji-yan led her fleet into battle against the Hollow Swarm, fighting not for revenge or glory, but for the simple belief that life was worth protecting. And the universe watched, remembering the warning humanity had given again and again, the warning that had finally been heard. Do not push us further, because you will not like what happens when you do. The lesson had been learned in blood and fire, but it would never be forgotten. Humanity had come to the stars as dreamers and traitors, but they had become something more, the shield that protected the innocent, the sword that punished the guilty, and the voice that spoke for those who could not speak for themselves. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy, written in the stars for all time. Mercy for those who deserved it, justice for those who earned it, and unwavering protection for those who needed it most.